this Friday's World Voices. Thank you for choosing to spend your Friday evening with us. My name is Shereen El Feki. I will be your moderator for the evening. And by moderator, I mean I will not talk. This is about the most talking that you will hear me do in the evening, because we're all here for the same reason, which is to listen to Shereen.
I'm here to hear you talk.
Listen to Shereen and Faye and her book. Has anybody read the book?
Don't tell them who did it.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Were there? Hold on. I saw a few hands. Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're gonna ask the first question. Okay. In that case, let me introduce you to our author this evening. Shereen is half of Shereen comes from my hometown, which is Cairo, Egypt, and the other half is from the exotic land of Wales. And Shereen spends most of her time in Cairo and London. Please correct me if I'm aligning you in any way. And she is a bioscientist by training, who sort of meandered her way into writing and journalism first, and then writing. I am too a journalist. I work for Thomson Reuters here in Singapore. And Shereen used to work for Al Jazeera, the broadcaster, and also for The Economist. But that was before she started writing what is one of the most talked about books about the Middle East. For many years, your book has generated a great deal of, I don't want to call it controversy, because it wasn't so much controversy, but it has certainly shone a spotlight on an aspect of the Middle East most people do not talk about. It isn't that Arabs don't have sex. Like normal people, they do.
We have 370 million Arabs to prove otherwise.
Correct. So, it's, I'll leave Shereen to share one of the best statistics I found in the book about the sexual lives of Arabs. So, and she will enlighten me. But I think for most people, when the Middle East comes to mind, I think they think suppression, burqas, Osama bin Laden, bombs, and architectural World Heritage sites. Yes, exactly. So this is kind of, I hate to use the cliche, but in a way this is lifting the veil or lifting the bed sheets in this case on people in the region. So without further ado, I'd like everybody to welcome Shereen. Please feel free, sit down. Oh, no problem at all. It's Friday, traffic is atrocious, we know.
I was going to say silencing mobile phones.
Yes, please, yeah, the ground rules. So, the ground rules, there's only one. Please turn off your mobile phone. For questions, I mean, we're not in school, so just shout out what you'd like to know. Okay, let's start. Shereen, if we may start, that startling statistic that you love to share about the book and about Arabs and their sexuality. Can you let everybody know about
the 40s?
Yes, correct. Yes.
Okay, so just as to take it back one step. So the Citadel, which gives my book its title, is the fact that the only socially accepted context for sexual life in the Arab region today is marriage. And it's not any old marriage. It's marriage that has to be approved by your family, it has to be approved by religion, it has to be registered by the state. And if you don't fit in the Citadel, you're not supposed to be having sex, and you're not supposed to be having children. The problem is that increasingly large numbers of people across the Arab region are not in the Citadel at any one time. And what are they going to do? And among these populations that don't fit in the Citadel are unmarried people. Now, as you may be aware, the age of marriage is rising in many countries in the Arab region. And in places like in Morocco and Tunisia, for example, the age of marriage for men is now 30. over 30, and its late 20s for young women. And in Islam and Christianity, believers are enjoined to remain chaste until marriage. And the Prophet Muhammad told us that if we cannot, if we have to wait to get married, we should fast. But he didn't mean fasting until you're in your 30s. So there is a real tension here about what are these young people going to do. It's very hard to do research on many aspects of sexual life in the Arab region. We don't have a good quantitative handle on what is happening inside bedrooms. And one of the trickiest areas to look is unmarried people. What is happening in their sexual lives? And I know that it's difficult because in Egypt, I was part of a group which tried to assess what's happening amongst young people. We looked at 15,000 young people across Egypt. We looked at all aspects of their lives. But the one thing we were not allowed to look at by the government was their sexual lives. There are some parts of the Arab region which are a little less coy about these matters, and they include Morocco and Tunisia and Lebanon. Where you do the research there, you find when you ask unmarried men, and these are young men up until age 30, and you ask them if they've had sex before marriage, around 40% will say yes. And that will rise to 80% in some populations. And this is sort of sexual relations of various descriptions. When you ask young women about this, 80% of young women across the board will say they have not had sex before marriage. This, of course, raises the question, who are all these young men having sex with, basically? And certainly there is a proportion, and we know from research on HIV/AIDS, which is allowing us to ask questions in some aspects of sexual life because it's public health, we know that they're having sex with female sex workers. But certainly young women are having sex before marriage, but the difficulty is the emphasis on female virginity is so strong that young women, if they are engaging in relations, simply do not want to admit it. And part of what I look at in the book is what are the difficulties when you can't talk about sex? How do we find a way to deal with these issues? Because the silence is not just deafening, it's deadly. When you have rising rates of HIV/AIDS, when you have sexual violence, when you have unwanted pregnancies, we need to find a way to talk.
Why do you think there is, there is this backwardness in the Arab world, if I may call it that? And I am from the region, so I can say backwardness. So without being stereotyped, when it comes to dealing with matters of sex, I mean, the Arab region, you've got some massive, mega modern metropolises, right? The infrastructure is amazing. You've got a place like Dubai, which is the Singapore of the Middle East. You've got ancient cities like Cairo, like Beirut, like Damascus, and yet when it comes to sex, as you said, there is this thick line which we don't talk about. Why is that?
Okay, well, to begin with that line that you're talking about, there are 3 red lines in the Arab region. These are lines that you're not supposed to cross. These are topics you're not supposed to challenge in word or deed. One of them is politics, and the line of politics has been well and truly crossed since 2011. The second red line is religion, and the third red line is sex. I think 2 points here. When you talk about backwardness, I think the term that I would use is regression, basically. Because one of the aspects I look at in this book, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because in talking to my father, and indeed in learning about my grandmother's life, I realized that things were not always as closed about sex as they are today. If you look back 1,000 years to the great writing of Arabic erotica, I am telling you that there is nothing in The Joy of Sex, or in Cosmopolitan, or dare I say it, 50 Shades of Grey, that they were not writing about 1,000 years ago in Baghdad. And the question I want to ask is why? Why have we got to this point now where we don't talk about anything and everything is forbidden and shameful? I think it's a very complex situation. What is interesting is that if you look at the public discourse around sex, and remember, it's not that people don't talk about sex in the Arab region. Women talk with women, men talk with men endlessly about sex. The difficulties come when you mix them together, and in the public domain, in media, in schools, in government circles. The closing down this great history of Arabic erotica it started to shut down around the 19th century. And it's not a surprise that that coincides with the European colonization of many countries in the Arab region. And it is a process which has certainly gained ground since the late 1970s. And the gaining ground also coincides with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. At the end of the day, if you really want to control someone, the most powerful instrument you have is sex wrapped up in religion.
Yes.
And whether it's the secular dictatorships or it's Islamist governments most recently, they use sex and sexual regulation as a way to try to keep people in line. And the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in a place like Egypt, which is due, as you know, to a response to military dictatorship and also the effect of millions of Egyptians going to the Gulf, working in Saudi Arabia, imbibing a very narrow-minded, austere form of Islam. And it's a form of Islam, it's very interesting, Islamists, Islamic conservatives, when they talk about immorality, they almost always focus on a woman's body and sexuality. You very rarely hear them talking about the immorality of poverty, of torture, of corruption. It's always the body of the woman, it's always sex, it's always the low-hanging fruit. So the closing down on sex, as many historians and social scientists have remarked, is part and parcel of a broader closing down in the Arab world on politics, in cultural thought, in sort of social thought and social discourse. And the really interesting question moving forward is, as we now are struggling on the scenic route to democracy in Egypt and Tunisia and other countries, what is that going to mean for our personal lives and for our sexual lives?
Where do you think that's heading?
Wow, if I knew that, I'd probably be running for president next year in Egypt. Throughout the book, I never use the term revolution, sexual revolution or political revolution, because that's not how change happens in the Arab region, quite frankly. I mean, if we look at even what's been happening on the political front, if by revolution we mean a dramatic break with the past, we're simply not seeing that. Particularly in Egypt, there are revolutionary aspects of the political change, but certainly it's not revolution per se. So if we're not seeing that dramatic break with the past in politics, we're certainly not going to see it in sexual life. Because sexuality is so much more complex than politics. It brings in the politics and the economics and the religion and tradition and gender and generations, which is why I looked at sex. Because it really is a lens in which to understand a society, any society, and I chose the Arab societies. In terms of where we're heading, I think that there has certainly been movement on some aspects of sexuality, sexual rights. When I started writing this book in 2007, 2008, hardly anyone would talk about sexual violence. Although we knew that sexual harassment, for example, in Egypt was a very big problem and remains a huge problem. And most recently, there's been a study from UN Women which has suggested that 99% of Egyptian women have experienced some form of sexual harassment in the past year. But women never spoke out about it, and they certainly never talked to the authorities about it, largely because it was usually the police who were doing some of the harassing. What's interesting in the intervening period is that you now find people talking about sexual violence, whether it's sexual violence in the home or in particular sexual violence on the streets. Now, the reason for this is quite a tragic development which we've seen in Egypt, the horrific assaults on women in Tahrir Square since the beginning of this year, highly organized, probably politically motivated. But the first time you see women standing up and saying, I was raped, unthinkable, because remember, your honor, your sexuality as a woman is related to your honor. This is how it's seen. And it's not just your honor, it's the honor of your family. And more particularly, it is the reputation of the men in your family. And so for a woman to speak out on these matters is not just a personal matter, it's a matter of the entire family's reputation. Very hard to do. And yet you now find women speaking out. You find NGOs, and God knows it's hard to work in civil society in Egypt at the best of times, and it's become very difficult since 2011, as you know. You find groups now out on the streets trying to help women deal with sexual violence, protect themselves, trying to give them help with emergency contraception, with rape, with aftercare for rape. These are extraordinary steps in Egypt. And what's most remarkable, it's not just young women helping other women, it's men helping women. Now, it's a small step, but it's, I think, a very, it's an important one. And it does show that in certain areas of sexual rights or sexuality, we are moving ahead. But in other areas, certainly, we're still struggling, we're still lagging behind.
And I would say it's an issue of the culture as well, and a lot of people seem to associate the sexual repression in the Middle East with Islam, and with the fact that Islam, as Shereen was saying, that Islam requires, women must be covered up, the women must be put aside, the women must be veiled, the women must be this, but it is that form of Islam that is now more prevalent, the more fundamental or strict, the Wahhabist Islam, which is now the more prevalent that calls upon that. It isn't so much the faith, but
interpretation.
It's the interpretation of the faith.
And it's true that also if you look at Christian communities in the Arab region, you will see very conservative attitudes as well, no matter where you look. I mean, female virginity is a big deal in the Arab region, and it doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or Christian. Female genital mutilations, of 90% of Egyptian women aged 15 to 49 are circumcised. And if you look at a younger generation, 15 to 17-year-olds, the most recent data we have shows that 80% of girls have been circumcised. And the rates are also high in Christian communities. They're not quite as high as they are in Muslim communities, but the only reason for that is that Christians in Egypt have a centralized power structure. They have a pope, they have priests, and the message goes out, and it's like a single message. They're all on the same page. In Islam, it's more complex because we have imams all over the place and preachers, and very often whatever is said by the big guns in Al-Azhar does not percolate, not filter because they don't hold the party line. What's interesting about FGM is that FGM is done, although women will tell you it's done because of tradition or it looks better or all this, or indeed they will justify it on religious grounds. The reason it's done is to control women's sexuality.
Can you just explain to, I'm not too sure what FGM is. Yes, I don't think it's as prevalent in Asia as it is in the Middle East.
It's not prevalent in Islamic countries in Asia.
That's right.
It's prevalent in Arab world.
Yes.
Well, it's not prevalent in the Arab world. It's common in Egypt, and it's common in countries which tend to border the Red Sea. And that's because it's not an Islamic practice. It is an ancient practice which is thought to have come up from sub-Saharan Africa and been taken up by in the Pharaonic period, basically, and then spread throughout the Red Sea area. We also find it interestingly, the war in Iraq revealed that there is female circumcision going on amongst Kurdish communities. And that was not known before Iraq was opened so dramatically. The point about FGM, so there are many different types of it, but basically in Egypt it involves, and so my apologies to the more squeamish members of the audience, it involves basically trimming the clitoris, and then
the milder version.
Yeah, and taking the little bordering flaps of flesh as well. And what's interesting is that it is often seen by outsiders as this is the power of the patriarchy and men are imposing this on women. It is certainly embedded in the patriarchy drives this, but it's women who make those decisions. Men are very rarely involved in whether a girl is cut or not. It's mothers and grandmothers.
It happens in Indonesia as well.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It does happen in this region.
And in Malaysia, they have a form of circumcision.
Snipping.
Yeah, I think it might be less intrusive, but it's certainly prevalent.
Yeah, and interestingly, it's one of the more perverse consequences of globalization. The problem is that it gets taken up by Islamic conservatives who basically now wrap it up in that this is sunnah, you should be doing this. And that's their arguments are based on very dubious interpretations of hadith, the sayings of the words and deeds of the Prophet, and then it gets wrapped up in Islamic fundamentalism and shipped out, basically. And so you see it popping up in places that it never occurred before. And of course it's a problem in diaspora communities in the West as well. There were a lot of concerns in Egypt when the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, was in power, that they were at the best ambivalent about this. And we have had lots of efforts in Egypt to try to contain the phenomenon. But in talking to women, and I have a big section on this in my book, it was very interesting talking to the women who are having their girls circumcised, or indeed the women who are doing the circumcising, most of whom are doctors, by the way. I mean, this is interesting. 75% of girls in Egypt who are circumcised go and have this done by the doctor. When you would argue, well, look, you know, the great figures of Islam, the Sheikh al-Azhar says that it is against Islam, they said something very interesting to me. They said, well, he speaks for the Mubarak government, and we all know that the Mubarak government is in hock to the West. And so these religious figures are just trying to undermine our traditional values. And what was interesting is that some women saw female circumcision as a form of political resistance to a government that they thought was, and rightly so, was unrepresentative.
Like the veil in many cases as well. In Egypt there was a whole movement towards veiling, and that was a form of political among young women, university students, among veiling, and that was their form of saying, I don't want your westernized politics, I want to go back to my quote-unquote roots.
But of course the roots are that the only people who we used to cover in Egypt, I mean my grandmother used to cover, but she came from the village. And so this covering is it's not even traditionally Egyptian, it's an amalgam of you know, things that are coming from the Gulf. 90% of young women in Egypt cover their heads. And what will be interesting to look at now is what will happen when we see a wave of unveiling, if you like, as a response to the changing conditions in Egypt. So watch this space.
Any questions so far? Would anybody like to?
Just curious.
Yes, ma'am.
In Cairo, I've been to Cairo before, and I don't see, as prevalent as in Asia, for example, women who are working, for example, prostitutes and call girls and things like that.
You do or you don't?
I do not see it in Cairo.
You're obviously not going to the right place.
Yeah. So perhaps, what is the situation like for women that are working as
Prostitutes.
in this industry?
Okay, so in terms of female sex work, I have a whole chapter on this. And essentially, female sex work is a very interesting phenomenon in the Arab region because it is both the most visible form of sex. How many people here have been to the Arab region? Okay, great. So if you go down to the lobby of any five-star hotel in a capital in the Arab region, you will see the sex industry at work.
But they're not Arabs, right? They are
Oh no, they're very, very much.
It depends where you are. If you're in the it depends where you are. If you're in the Gulf, for example, in let's say Dubai, you will find a mix of female sex workers, many of whom will be expats, and they will be expat Asian, or also you will find Moroccan women. I mean, one of the interesting things is about sexual stereotypes in the Arab region. And it's something that the people in the Arab world talk about amongst themselves, but they don't show to the outside world. So among these sexual stereotypes is that all Moroccan women are prostitutes. And I'm not kidding. No, I'm not kidding. Because there was, and the Moroccans are open about this, there was an edition of a great, one of their most cutting-edge magazines called Tel, and the cover was Moroccan women as seen by Arabs, witches and prostitutes. And basically sorcery being just part of the sex workers' toolkit to attract men. And as they said in this article, it's fascinating, and they said, you know, Moroccan isn't a nationality, it is a profession. And indeed, in Saudi Arabia, in 2010, they actually prevented Moroccan women under age 21 from getting visas to do Umrah and Hajj because they were afraid that they would just stay around and work as sex workers. So sex work is extraordinary. Female, I'm talking specifically here about female sex work. Male sex work is a whole separate industry. It is very common. It takes all different shades and forms. It really is a triumph of private enterprise, really. It caters to all comers. In Egypt, for example, where I talk about the situation for sex workers, we have a particular form of sex work called the summer marriage. And the summer marriage essentially consists of wealthy men coming from the Gulf. They come on shopping sprees, usually with their families, and one of the things they buy are girls from a particular set of villages south of Cairo. And these girls are being essentially trafficked into sex work by their parents. they get, there's a whole network of brokers. It's a very organized business. And what's interesting about this particular form of sex work, which I discuss in detail in the book, is that it falls under the veneer of the cover of marriage. So there is a sort of, these couples enter into an Islamic marriage contract. It's not registered by the state, but it is technically shari'i, it is technically
Sanctified.
Yeah, technically in conformance with Islamic law, dubious intent aside. And in talking to these girls who are in these marriages, I mean, they're just desperate. And they do it because they're poor and their families need the money. And I had one heartrending interview with a young woman who said, I don't talk about this in my family, but because I don't want my sister to know what I'm doing, I do this because I want her not to have to do this. And the unfortunate thing is that sex workers are so marginalized, and they are so self-stigmatizing that it's incredibly difficult to reach out to them. So much of the research for my book was done under the umbrella, if you like, of HIV/AIDS. If you come into the Arab region and say, hey, I want to talk about sex, very tricky there. If you say, look, I want to talk about HIV and public health, it gives it a respectability. So you put on your white coat, you get in the door, then you take off your white coat, and you get down to the nitty-gritty of sexuality. In HIV, it's very hard to reach out to these women, and I have a whole section in the book of a fantastic group in Morocco. Morocco is much more open on sex work.
If you could, highlight also how you've got the red light district there, where it's socially.
Yeah, so in Morocco, I was out with this group called ASAS, fantastic group, one of a couple that are trying to reach out to vulnerable populations on HIV. You may think we don't have HIV in the Arab region, but actually we're now one of only 2 parts of the world where HIV is on the rise. In any case, so I was out with this group, and they do the rounds of sex workers, they try to help them with information and with condoms. And we met 2 young women, they're hairdressing students, and they were turning tricks on the Atlantic Corniche to make some pocket money. And when the outreach workers tried to explain to them the importance of protecting themselves against HIV and offered the condoms, the young women said, no, we don't need condoms. We only have anal and oral sex because we want to get married and we have to be virgins on our wedding night. So the way that they define virginity is by a piece of anatomy, an intact hymen. And this actually speaks to a really fundamental tension in sexual life, which is between appearance and reality. It's not what you do that causes social tensions, it's what you're seen to be doing. And that drives stuff under the table. So we have sex work, sex tourism masquerading as marriage. We have with girls who as they were trying to protect a piece of anatomy and trying to protect the appearance of virginity, are opening themselves to a world of trouble. So it's really it's troubling to try to deal with sex workers. The example that you're talking about, Miral, the one exception to all this is in Tunisia, where they actually have a form of legalized prostitution. They have brothel districts. Yes, and this is a legacy of colonization. In fact, we used to have this system in England. I'm not sure about Southeast Asia, what was happening. But certainly the French and the British, when they were rolling out the empire, arranged these organized brothels where sex workers would get regular medical testing. And this was not in the interest of the sex workers, this was in the interest of particularly the troops, the French and British troops. That system persisted in Tunisia, and you find these tiny streets. And it's a tough life, definitely. These women are, they do it because it's safer, and it's safer than illegal sex work, which is just not outside these designated brothel areas. But the women have a very hard time of it. And it's interesting, with the rise of Islamic conservatives in Tunisia, these women were under attack. Their brothels have been attacked, they have been closed down. And as one of the madams said to me, what if they shut us down? What will I do? This is the only thing I know how to do. And in a place where you have 30% unemployment for the under 30s, as I say in my book, if you go to a brothel and you quite literally work your ass off, you can make much more money than you ever will. And so what are the alternatives? what are the alternatives for women across the Arab region? Sex work is not a lifestyle choice for most women. It's the last resort.
If I can talk about, and also just to ask all of your opinion as well. I mean, as Shereen mentions in her book, and you must, if there is, if there is one main reason to read this book, and I will not give it away, it is the virgin birth. Yes, in the Middle East, we have virgins who give birth, and
Yes, this is your 2 millennia after the coming of Christ.
Exactly. That was one of the anecdotes in the book that completely blew me away. I mean, I thought I know everything about the region, and I'm a journalist. I'm jaded and cynical. So there's very little about the human race that surprises me. But that one anecdote, I could not believe that in the 21st century we're reading that. But please read the book. The issue of the hymen. And the issue of, the fact that you have to have an intact hymen to be considered a virgin. And the lengths to which women in the Arab region go. Shereen explains that a lot in her book about, how important it is to maintain that piece of flesh. And there's women who go to plastic surgeons, to the women who have ruptured their hymen. And they actually go to gynecologists and surgeons to get fake hymens reinstated so that they are not used goods, so to say, on their marriage. Is this something that is prevalent in Asia, or is this, or is this something that is uniquely Arab? Ladies.
Is it important?
Yeah.
I mean, so in the Arab region, the issue is this, that you pretty well, even I know women who have told their prospective husbands that they've had relations before marriage. And even the most progressive men who say, yes, okay, that's fine, I don't mind, we are moving ahead. You find, though, that these women have found that when they run into trouble in their marriages, that this is brought up against them. That, I don't trust you, you've had relations before marriage. So it's a problem before marriage, getting into marriage, and it's a problem during marriage. Is female virginity considered to be a deal breaker? In Singapore, is it a deal breaker?
No, I don't know in Singapore.
Even among the Malay community, the Muslim community, it's not as it's not the sort of thing that anybody.
Culturally, it's still prevalent. It's just that we don't talk about it. For example, when we get married, we have a wedding night, it's like a stage.
Yes.
So we have a thing called Siripinam. Siripinam is only allowed if the bride is a virgin, which means if it's not on the stage, which means she hasn't been married before, or she's not a virgin. So that thing is only as an indication that she's a virgin. But now it's become more like an aesthetic value. It's just nice. But back in the past, it is a symbolic gesture. Siripinam only allowed for virgin brides.
So in Egypt, for example, they're not just going to take your word for it that you're a virgin. So we have a practice known as dokhla, and dokhla today essentially involves putting a sheet underneath the bride on the wedding night to catch the blood of defloration. And it is not just a countryside practice. So one of the stories I tell in the book is of a friend of mine who she's a scientist, and her father is a lawyer in Cairo. So these are educated people. And her groom was getting incredibly anxious before the wedding night because he was getting calls from his future father-in-law to say, you must tell us when she bleeds. Because this is a matter of family honor that we delivered a virgin bride. Remember, this is the family's reputation at stake. Anyway, he was getting so many calls, and he was so anxious that he actually tried to take his bride to the cinema on their wedding night, rather than to consummate their marriage, is when he turned off his mobile phone, and his father-in-law was no longer texting. And the next day, her parents turned up and took the sheet of, what's called the sheet of honor, and took it back to show it to family and relatives. Now, this does seem to be an extraordinarily sort of controlling and intrusive custom. And it is very dangerous. I mean, girls who do not bleed on their wedding night, I know of women who have been returned to their families. And honor killings are a real fact of life. They're a real threat for untold numbers of women. I talk about women in my book who live under the fear of that. But as with most things to do with sexual regulation, women throughout the ages have found a way to get around it. So what's interesting about dokhla is that some women in Cairo, you find, actually use it as a tool of empowerment. These are women who come from poor areas of Cairo. They want to be able to travel. They want to have the freedom, for example, if they can get a job, to go outside their neighborhood and work. And so they basically cut a deal with their parents. And they say, look, okay, you're worried about me going further afield because something might happen to me. I might lose my virginity and the family will be dishonored. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll go through dokhla for you. And that is my exchange. And in doing dokhla, I will prove to you that I have been a good girl. So women do find ways of turning these restrictions around and using them to their advantage. That's one of the most interesting aspects I found during this research. Very often women in the Arab region are seen as repressed, controlled, but they also have agency. They also have the ability to make decisions. It just sometimes looks different to the way that people find fulfillment outside the Arab region, and in particular in the West.
Dukhla, by the way, comes from the Arabic word yadkhul, the verb yadkhul, which means to enter. So it is literally, entering into the male member entering the female body and also entering into marriage as well, or entering into this.
Because marriage is synonymous. I mean, this is interesting. Marriage is synonymous with sex, basically. So nikah refers both to marriage, but also to intercourse. And one of the most interesting aspects in researching this book also is that when I went back to the old books of Arabic erotica, books which are simply not available anymore in Cairo, for example, and many educated people have no idea that these books exist. When you go back, you find this amazing writing, and one of the most extraordinary things is that we used to have this incredibly rich vocabulary in Arabic to talk about sex. So I don't know if you can see this. This is the cover of the Canadian edition of my book. And there is one medieval book which had over 1,000 verbs for to have sex. And this piece of calligraphy is actually made up of some of the lost words for sex, which I gave to words which are simply not recognized, like and I gave these words to an Iraqi calligrapher called Wissam Shaukat in Dubai, and I asked him to create the body of a woman for me, and that's exactly what he did. What's interesting today, though, is that, generally speaking, Arabs, if they speak another language, will feel far more comfortable talking about sex in English or French or even Hebrew, if they're Palestinians living in Israel, than they do speaking in Arabic. And one of the difficulties is and it's a measure of how bundled up we have become about sex. And some of the pioneers I talk about in this book, people who are really trying to push the boundaries and challenge the taboos, one of the aspects they're looking at is how can we reclaim Arabic as a language of sex? Because it's all part and parcel of opening up thinking on the subject.
You wanted to ask Shereen.
Yeah, when you go to the Middle East, and you switch on the TV, be it in Dubai, be it in Cairo, anywhere, and this is on a government-owned satellite, you find all these TV stations with the most erotic dancers that you could ever find, right? And it's way before we just learned about, well, I just learned about twerking last week, right? So you have all these, they're probably on the verge of pornography. Is that part of the suppression? Is that a way to get the steam, to blow steam? Why does the government help these channels become? They haven't taken their licenses. They'll take the licenses of religious channels. However, these channels are let to go and broadcast, and you still have the harassment and that on the streets of Cairo.
Yeah, you're obviously not surfing to the very far reaches of the spectrum, because it's not just dirty dancing that you see on Arab television. You actually do see sex channels. You can find them in the back. If you head up to 700, 800 on your dial, it's amazing where researching a book on sexuality will take you. It's a very interesting question. It's actually one question I posed to the National Censor in Egypt, because there was, when I started writing this book in 2007, 2008, there was a wave of cinema which was actually tackling some issues in sexuality reasonably frankly. And I asked him, quite frankly, is this bread and circuses, basically? Do you offer viewers sex, titillation, if you like, because you don't want, what you are really censoring is politics. Mm-hmm. And he said, interestingly, he said, yeah, we have a hierarchy of things that we censor. And the first is politics, and the second is religion, and sex comes down the line. Again, there are limits, of course, to this. So, for example, you don't find sex scenes as you do in the West, per se. If I can just digress for a minute, because there's another really interesting form of censorship that happens in the Arab region, and that's through subtitling.
Yes.
So, if you have a film, a Western film, for example, which has a sex scene, that's basically cut. And any of you who have tried to watch television, foreign films in the Arab region will find that sometimes they just don't make any sense at all, because the pivotal scenes have just been deleted because they had sex scenes in them. But in addition to that, the way that they translate sexualized dialogue from particularly English into Arabic is a form of censorship, and euphemism is the censor's best friend. And I spent time with a group in Lebanon that actually does dubbing and subtitling of films, and it was really very interesting. The man I interviewed said, "We don't have fixed rules, but it's clear. When you translate, you have to use the pattern in your own language. If we don't know a word in English, we research it. And once we find it in Arabic, we judge if we can use it." He gave me a few examples. You can't say, "I'm going to get laid tonight." You can say, "I'm going to have fun." In the subtitler's lexicon, sex becomes relations. An erection is excited. A penis becomes a member. Semen is liquid. And my favorite, that deviant practice for fellatio. They really are pushing the boundaries and of course sex sells. It does sell. And it's this very interesting dance and the tension, and it does appear to be completely hypocritical at one level. And remember, it's also the sexualization of women. You very rarely see men put into this position, and that's because of the patriarchal structures. I think the interesting question moving forward are will you see people challenging this? And in particular women. Will we see women actually speaking up against all this regulation and all this objectification? We're not quite there yet in the region.
We're not quite at the stage where blurred lines, having the debate about the Robin Thicke song, blurred lines, and whether that sexualizes women or not. So,
if I can just give you an example, so as I said, there's some aspects of sexual life that are being talked about in the Arab region, and there is progress on sexual violence. People are speaking out. But that's what I would call a negative right. That's your freedom from violence, or your freedom from discrimination or coercion. There is a whole set of sexual rights which are positive rights. My right to express my ideas about sex, or my right to access information. And there, definitely, we are not at that point. And the most interesting example of this is two young women in the Arab region, one in Egypt, one in Tunisia. The woman in Egypt is called Alia Al-Mahdi, and she is known as the nude photo revolutionary. Because in 2011, Alia Al-Mahdi, who's a student at American University in Cairo, posted naked pictures of herself on her blog. Now I have to say that the pictures were more Victorian postcard than Victoria's Secret, but she got over 1 million hits in 2 days. Now it's not difficult to find naked pictures of naked Arab women on the internet, but she gave her unveiling a really political spin. She said, "Look, this is my right in the spirit of the revolution to express myself, and it is the right to control my body." Really revolutionary statement here, given what we know about personal honor and family honor. Okay, so religious conservatives, unsurprisingly, come down on Ali al-Mahdi like a ton of bricks. But what was fascinating is that political liberals were aghast. And one of the groups that she was said to have been associated with, April 6th movement, a youth group in the forefront of the uprising against Mubarak, said, this woman has nothing to do with us. And this is not the revolution that we are fighting for. And so there are limits to how far people see, particularly men, but also most women, they see the change. The other woman is Amina Sagouri, who's in Tunisia. She also bared all. Now, she's part of the Femin movement. Does anyone here not know what Femin is? Okay, who knows about Femin? Okay, please explain what Femin is in 140 characters or less.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'll get it right, but I think there are a bunch of young women, tend to be sort of, I think 20 to 40 probably, or younger, and they use they use nudity to make a statement about having control over their body and life. So they paint on their bodies, they go bare-breasted and so on, and it's always to do with a political issue or an issue of self-expression.
Yeah, thank you. And the Femin protesters have been in front of mosques, for example, and embassies, Arab embassies across Europe, and indeed in Tunisia itself, bearing all and protesting the patriarchy and what they consider to be the oppressive structures of Islam. And Amina took this up and she bared all. And what I find interesting about the Femin experience is that it really does show how not to achieve social change in the Arab world. We don't get change through revolution, we don't get change through confrontation, we get change through negotiation. And in my book, this is a book about problems, but it's also a book about solutions, and it's about people across the Arab region who are trying to deal with the taboos in the best way that they can, knowing how things happen in the West. And yet they choose a different route, and this is very clear in my chapter on what we would call in international parlance as LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, pansexual. We have individuals in the Arab region, of course, we have activists in the region who are trying to find space, and they know the history of the sexual rights movement, the gay rights movement in the West, and they don't think it's for the Arab region. And so again, it's not about beating your breast or indeed bearing your breast. It's about a very patient form of negotiation is how we get there.
Speaking about homosexuality, I was going to bring that up just now when you brought it up. Now, in your book, what I found most interesting was how within the family, it seemed that it was more acceptable to come out to your family to a certain extent. I mean, there was the case of the gentleman who told his father that he was, that he was gay, and the father was like, okay, that's fine, no problem. Just don't tell your mother.
Yeah.
Don't tell your mother.
But also, it's okay. But are you? But interestingly, are you active or are you passive?
Yes.
Because there's an age-old distinction in Arab culture, as there is in many parts of the global South, that if you are the active partner in sodomy, then somehow you're more of a man, and it's demeaning if you're the passive partner because you're somehow in the position of a woman. I have to say that is unusual, however, because most people I know would operate on a don't ask, don't tell basis when it comes to sexual life with their parents. They just simply don't want to have these conversations. And in the case of young men and women who are found to have same-sex inclination, very often what this means, if your parents find out, and increasingly they're finding out because you forget to put your screensaver on, and they find your profile on Facebook or on Gay Romeo or something. If they find out, it usually involves a trip to the doctor to see what can be done. And what's interesting is that religious conversion in the Arab region is a very big deal. I mean, this truly is a matter of life and death if you are found to convert from Islam to Christianity. Sexual conversion, however, to turn gay people straight, is not only no big deal, it's considered to be a good and desirable thing. And so in the book, I have sections in which I'm talking to psychiatrists who specialize in what's called reparative therapy, which is completely discredited in established medical circles in the West, and yet is alive and well in many parts of the Arab region. To be fair, though, I also interview psychiatrists who are involved in affirmative therapy, trying to make people who have same-sex relations feel more comfortable in their skin. But it's certainly not. It's not socially acceptable, and religion is a big obstacle to finding peace. And many of the men and women I interviewed were really struggling because they wanted to reconcile the needs of the flesh with the needs of the faith. They were deeply religious, and just found it a real hardship to try to get the balance. But there are interesting examples in the book also of initiatives in which that balance has been struck, at least in quiet rooms.
In the Singapore experience, I know that homosexuality is outlawed here. It is by law illegal, and it has been used by the government here as well to kind of, I think, prosecute people. So, but I think socially, would you say that it is more acceptable? Yeah, I mean, I have gay colleagues and partners, so I guess I'm just wondering about the acceptance from a faith point of view as well. Is that something that people is that an issue for people in Singapore?
It's not that big an issue because we have an openly gay pastor and a recent politician also came out openly. So it seems like it's maybe the side of faith and homosexuality to a certain extent. I haven't heard of any instances where there are, of course, some fundamentalist church groups who try to preach against it, but it's more so in other countries, religion rather than something.
But one of the interesting aspects in the Arab region is that in Egypt, for example, male sodomy is not technically illegal. And yet, I talk time and again of men who are picked up by the system, are subjected to horrific torture, including the famous or infamous anal exam, which is incredibly popular with authorities, which is somehow thought to show through deformities of the anus that a man is homosexual, and on absolutely no basis in scientific thinking at all, and yet extremely popular. And yet, if you look at Tunisia, for example, which actually has a law which explicitly criminalizes not only male homosexuality, but interestingly female homosexuality, gay men and women there have a much easier time of it. Even certainly before the Islamists came to power, irrespective of the law, that their lives were much easier. And that goes to illustrate another point I talk about in the book, is that certainly law, it's important to have good laws. And by good laws, I'm speaking as a progressive Muslim Egyptian. Laws that promote sexual rights. But the law is not sufficient. In Egypt, we have a law which criminalizes FGM, and yet it's common. We have a law which limits abortion except all but very narrow cases, and yet illegal abortions are a thriving business. Law is not enough. You need change beyond the law. And that's something to keep in mind as we move forward in reforms.
Education, I think education is kind of the key, and that's one of the aspects you touch about in the book as well, in the Palestinian territories. And
absolutely, sexuality education could best be described as a shambles across the Arab region, and it's very interesting that in Egypt, for example, we say thank you, youth of Egypt, for leading us into uprising and helping us to depose the dictator Mubarak. But then when it comes to sexuality education, you know what? We don't trust you. We're not going to give you the information so that you can make responsible decisions about your sexual life, about your reproductive life, because if we open your eyes, you will be fornicating wildly. It's a double standard, basically, like so many of the double standards we see in the region. The state of sexual education is so bad. Let me give you an example. I was talking to a young woman. She was at the time, a commerce student at the leading universities in Egypt. And she asked me, Dr. Shereen, I have a question. I am newly engaged, and I am concerned that if my fiancé stands in front of the air conditioner, I will become pregnant. Okay. It took a few minutes of questioning to realize what was going on here. So this young woman, the only class she had received on reproductive biology was plant biology. And she confused or conflated sperm with pollen. And she thought it was going to waft over from her fiance and impregnate her. Now, it's easy to laugh at this, but it's actually tragic. I mean, this is really serious. And it explains to a great extent why our orphanages are chock-a-block full of kids, because we have virtually no sexuality education and there's very little access to contraception for unmarried people. And there are some very interesting and innovative programs across the Arab region to try to get sexuality education into schools. And I talk about it in the book, a fantastic Palestinian woman living in Israel who's working with incredibly conservative communities, Palestinian communities, to get sex education into schools. And what's most amazing is that the way she does it, she studied in the States, so she knows exactly how the West does this. But she said, you know what, it's not relevant for our society. We need to do things differently. And so she's devised this extraordinarily innovative project. And what's most amazing about it is that they get the education into schools. They get parents wanting to know more themselves, because parents are afraid of looking, as one of them said, I don't want to look like an idiot when my kid comes home and asks me questions. But what they found most interestingly is that it changes the whole family dynamic, because they find that when both kids and parents feel more comfortable about these issues, the parents, for example, will start hugging each other in front of the kids. I cannot tell you how radical that is in many Arab households. I mean, husbands and wives are simply not physically demonstrative with one another in front of the children. And so the whole family is transformed. Marriages are transformed, relations with the kids are transformed. And the most extraordinary thing about this program is that she insists on everyone in the program speaking Arabic. Again, part of this reclaiming language. Arabic is a language of sex.
The families in the Middle East it's very patriarchal, and like it is in South Asia, like it is in many traditional countries where, you know, he is the man, we do not disturb him, we do not bother him, we do not, and we all bow, kowtow to the middle figure. Shereen and I are exceptions, as if you to the majority of the population. But coming back to that, actually, why? I mean, you obviously grew up in a very open household. Your father is an Egyptian. Your mother is Welsh, and yet you were saying that your family is originally from the countryside. How much of a shock was it for them when your father married a white woman?
It's an interesting question. So they never thought, on both sides of my family, they never thought the marriage would last more than 6 months to a year, and are extremely disappointed that it's heading on for 45 years plus. So that turned out to be a disappointment. So then it was me, and so I'm growing up in the West, and I'm going to go off the rails, and then sadly when I turned out to be studious, that was a great disappointment as well. So I think the aunts have a lot to. Are desperate for gossip. They moved on to the newer generation, so I'm just a complete loss. It was surprisingly well received by my grandparents,
yes,
for example, and my mother converted to Islam. Although, as you know, and Muslim men can marry Ahli Kitab. They can marry people of the book, Christians. But my mother chose to convert to Islam. It was a matter of conviction, not coercion. So.
To this day, it is considered very unusual or radical for a Muslim woman, an Arab Muslim woman, to marry a foreign man. I know this isn't so much of an issue here in Singapore. I know quite a few Muslim Malay women who have foreign husbands, and also in other parts of Asia, in Indonesia as well, and in Malaysia. But in the Arab world, it is considered A, unusual, B, the man would have to convert and sort of become even a more radical Muslim than the woman herself and her parents to basically convince society that he is a good person. So that's just, again, I guess that's more cultural than...
And it's an incendiary topic in the Egypt, certainly when you find Christians marrying Muslims and vice versa.
You have been a surprisingly quiet audience. Yes, ma'am.
So if you're an independent, liberated woman in the Arab world today, living there, how oppressive would it be for those people? I mean, how, is going to the West the only answer, or can one create a life in these cities for themselves?
I think this question also addressed to Miral. I think it depends. It's very hard to generalize about the Arab region, and although we've been doing that for over an hour now, it is extreme. It's vast and it's varied, and it's diverse within countries. So you can't. Depends on the education and the class and the location as well. Some women do manage, and I do talk about them in my book. They do manage to lead these lives. They keep it quiet. They are not challenging the established order. Again, it's very interesting around the question of virginity, because we had this famous instance in which a woman in Egypt, it was one of a group of female protesters who were subjected to forcible virginity testing by the military authorities. And this is a tool of intimidation, basically. You want to get women off the streets, you're certainly going to deter female protesters if they think that they're going to be subjected to a virginity test. What was very interesting is that this woman said, I'm not taking this anymore, and she took a case to court against the military, and she lost, actually. But what was most interesting is that in this whole debate, she never questioned, why on earth are we talking about virginity? This is a political matter. Why on earth is virginity relevant? She questioned the forced testing, not the importance of virginity. And so you don't find women openly confronting the system, which is, again, the difficulty with femin. That's not how we're going to get movement on this. So yes, many women do manage to have a room of their own. Some women manage to move out. It's hard if you're not married. In Cairo, anyway, but they do it. But it often requires quite a lot of negotiation, cutting deals with your family. So you don't just have to move to the West to find a degree of happiness. And increasingly, I'm finding that women are speaking out.
Yes.
It seems to be more so after 2011. I talk in related development. I talk about one of the most famous sex therapists in Egypt called Heba Ott. And she said that she's seen a real change in her patients since the uprising, that women were no longer willing to put up with lousy sex lives. And that they would come and say, my husband is just no good, and this is not acceptable. And
She has a TV show as well.
Yeah, she used to. And what's interesting about that is that it's actually absolutely fundamental to Islam. That lovemaking is un-Islamic. And the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to talk extensively of the importance of foreplay for women, for wives, that men are supposed to satisfy their wives. This is their duty. And you fast forward to the 21st century, and I have a whole chapter on desperate housewives. And these women were just telling me how lousy their husbands were. And what was interesting is I gave them, it was so contrary to what Westerners think about the Arab lover, because we have these books, the desert romance, the sheikh, and they go on even today. They're published by Harlequin Romance or Mills and Boon, if you're familiar with the English publishing industry. And they have lines like, I don't know, the Arab lover, he pleasured his partner until she could take pleasure no more, and then, only then, he sought his release. So I gave these books to my friends, and they laughed their heads off. I said, where do Western women get this idea? Said it's 5 minutes only. It's no French kissing, no foreplay. It's his pleasure only. He falls asleep and then he watches the telly. And I have to say that these problems are not unique to the Arab world. For sure. And so but women are starting to speak up. But also, Miral, over to you. I mean, in your experience, perhaps not your personal experience, but out of your family and friends. Can women find a room of their own?
Yes, you can. But before I start talking about me, because I promised you I would, but I will. You had a question, ma'am.
Who carries out these tests of virginity? Is it a female doctor?
It
No, it's a
wasn't
male.
in that case.
In that case, it's a male
doctor.
doctor.
So if they're a virgin, what's the situation then? Have they not been shamed? Is the owner not lost? To have,
No, as long as you don't. But again, you can do it visually, right? You can see the hymen without actually having to prove it. But you actually raise a very good point, because one of the unspoken problems in the Arab region is gynecological care and testing for unmarried women. Because I know of women who are suffering from, for example, cysts, for example, they cannot get ultrasounds done because doctors are afraid of breaking their hymen. Again, the cost of appearance versus reality.
Some women are prevented from doing certain sports like horse riding or cycling, again, for the fear that this would rupture their hymen and they would have to be returned. Yes.
I had one other question. You mentioned that women are standing up and saying they were raped in Tahrir Square. Is that just the women only standing up, or are their fathers and brothers standing up and supporting them?
Again, it's a minority of a minority who are taking this step, but in the few instances we've had, we've also seen the male husbands, for example, supporting their wives, even on national television. So this is really a huge step.
One of my friends was Hania Mohib. She was assaulted during one of the protests in Tahrir. She was surrounded by a group of men. They ripped her clothes off, and then she was overwhelmed, didn't know what to do. Another group of men came, and women, men and women came. They protected her. They helped her with her clothes or put somebody else's clothes on them and took them. And she went on national television. It wasn't television, I believe. She went on national television and spoke about this and said, "This is what happened to me." I mean, she certainly made a huge fuss online, and this is what happened to me. She was not ashamed of her, and wherever she went, her husband stood beside her. And he was there, listening to her, holding her hand, making sure, and a lot of it, I mean, I'm sure they have a solid relationship, but a lot of it was exactly to deflect, what Shereen was talking about, this issue of, I am standing by my woman in this case, and I'm not allowing, anybody to malign her. Sir. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry, that's the, please come back. This is the journalist in me. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
People who admit they've been raped in the Arab world, do they get into more trouble? Meaning, do they get arrested for admitting that someone has assaulted them?
I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, okay, I'll give you a very good example of this.
Are they intimidated by the fact that you can get into more trouble?
Okay, so we have an illustration of this. A couple of weeks ago, there was a Norwegian woman who went to authorities and said that she was raped in Dubai, and then they threw her in prison for immoral, for I think conduct violating public defamation.
Yes.
So spreading immorality.
Illegal,
Illicit relations outside of marriage. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons, because women don't speak out, because the idea is that, look, as a woman, your virtue, your virginity is so important, you're supposed to protect it. And if something happens, the assumption is that you put yourself in harm's way. And then, of course, you wouldn't speak out about it because it's about your family's reputation. It's not just you on the line. And so one of the interesting aspects of that case in Dubai is that essentially you have a code which is applying to a minority of population, Emiratis, applying to the majority who are outsiders. This woman did what a Westerner would do. She went to authorities and she was expecting the care that she would get. And there's a real cultural tension there. But in the case of the assaults against these women in Cairo, certainly one of the NGOs working with them, they found, for example, that when they took women to the hospital for post-rape care, that many of the doctors would not touch them. They said they used to be in harm's way. Doctors are one of the biggest obstacles, actually. I mean, they're the ones who are doing FGM very happily. They're making money out of it. Homophobia is just rampant in the medical profession. Most doctors, gynecologists, studies have shown will not talk about sexual matters with their patients, even when it's a question of health. You've got a middle-class morality. You've got a group that has been highly infiltrated, if you like, by fundamentalist Islam, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood has got lots of followers in the medical profession. It's problematic, to be sure. But the key to it is not just changing law, because you have countries where we have laws against sexual assault, and women are still afraid to come forward. As one of the women who's working on sexual harassment in Egypt said, sometimes you feel, when we try to achieve social change, that you are moving the sea with a spoon, because there's just so much that needs to be done.
The attitudes towards rape tend to be similar to in India, where and the whole Indian experience has been blown up about what happened with the lady in the bus, and also with the lady who was raped in Mumbai a couple of weeks ago. It's shush, 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 shush. Oh my God, this is a calamity. Let's not talk about it. Let's just pretend everything's okay. You're fine, you live. And it's like, how can we tell the neighbors? How can we explain it? How can we explain it away?
But it's all about appearance.
Absolutely.
How are we going to look?
Exactly.
And overcoming that requires huge changes. You talked about education, and it's not just sexuality education we need. We need religious education. Young people are unable to think their way. I'm talking about in Islam in particular. Young people are unable to think their way through Islam. They have so little knowledge. They have so few critical faculties. They have so little freedom of thought that if they have a question, what do? You call up the sheikh on television, or you send in an email to get a fatwa. And we really do need to change that so that people can think through the faith. And at the end of the day, the key to education is not just in the classroom; it's in the living room. Because if you talked about the father as the patriarch and the great man, well, where does that start? That starts with how women raise their sons. And if you raise your daughters to serve your sons, if your sons get to go out and your girls have to stay at home,
Yes.
if your sons can roam the internet and your girls are being supervised at every click, this is how those double standards start, and this is how you end up with lousy marriages in a generation to come. It starts there.
The reason the education system across the region is so bad is because it's been that way. I mean, I can speak, and it's been that way for decades and decades, and it has served authoritarian governments. When you have a population that is told, is spoon-fed, and is told by the government what to think and how to behave, they're very, very easy to control. And when you turn off the critical faculties and thinking of people, then again, they're very, very easy to control. And that is across the board about everything. So instead of, and many people would not have the fact that that erotica, there was Arab erotica, the fact that the Prophet Muhammad actually talked about sexuality, and this is not an aspect of Islam that is talked about amongst Muslims in the Arab world. I'm not sure what if that's something that's talked about in Asian Muslim countries, but it certainly is not something that we were ever told in our part of the world. And it is always, the sexual is always considered the Western, always considered the other, right? This is what other people do rather than what normal people do.
Which is why I go so much back to the history. I'm not like some sort of sexual Salafi here. I'm not thinking we need to go back to some mythical golden age of sexual liberalism. That's not the point. The point is that when young people want to question some of these taboos, that when the religious conservatives, the Salafis, for example, come back at them and say, you're selling out to the West. No, actually we're not. And in fact, one could argue that Islam to be authentically Arab and to be authentically Muslim, that one actually considers the possibilities within the faith of sexual fulfillment, albeit within the context of marriage, but nonetheless one thinks about these issues. It's not selling out, it is actually being true to our heritage.
Sorry, we've gone over time. Is any other questions? Anything? Yes, sir. Yep. No. Okay. Again, it's the journalism. Yes, sir.
Are you going to translate it into Arabic?
Very interesting question. It's the husband of the journalist who asked also the tough question. Okay, so this is the situation vis-a-vis Arabic. The difficulty is a commercial one, interestingly. You may be aware that Arabic, there are so few books translated from other languages into Arabic. It's one of the lowest proportions in the world, and it really means that the Arab world is cut off from the world of ideas. The difficulty I have with Arab publishers is that it's not just translating the book. You can do a translation and put it on an e-book on the internet. But the difficulty is that this book needs to be physically, as a physical entity, getting it into people's hands. And the reason for that is for the reason I said that a lot of people don't have access to the internet. In Egypt, only about 30% of people have on the internet. And also, if you're a woman, you're not going to have hours to read this book on the internet. Someone else is probably going to be watching it. The difficulty is that in order to make money in publishing in the Arab region, you have to sell in 3 markets in particular. One of them is Egypt, another is the United Arab Emirates, and the third is Saudi Arabia. Okay, so of those 3, my book is unlikely to see the light of day in English in Saudi Arabia, and it has actually been pulled from the shelves, I've been told, in Dubai.
I'm not surprised.
So
How about Cairo? Sorry.
it is on sale, and in fact, it is sold. I've been told it's selling out in Cairo, and so that's very gratifying. My dream at the end of the day is to see Sex on the Citadel 5 years from now. To see Sex on the Citadel in Arabic on the coffee table of one of the desperate housewives I interviewed. But more importantly, to see her daughter on my website, which is sexandthecitadel.com, not just reading it, but actually contributing to it. And in a sense, it is a test of my optimism. I am cautiously optimistic about the future of Egypt and its neighbors. I do think that despite all the turmoil now, that we are moving in the right direction. It's just a very bumpy and very scenic route to democracy. But this will ultimately be the test. And if that were to come to pass, if my book were to be translated into Arabic, then I would consider Sex and the Citadel a job well done.
The reason I ask is, I'm sure you're aware that one of the books that made a huge change on the book scene and was turned into a movie was which touched on homosexuality and sex before marriage, and that was kind of a big hit, which opened the eyes of a lot of people in the Middle East. So, yes, Al-Aswan. And your book is kind of an educational book. It's an eye-opener to the sexual lives of people of the Middle East, who a lot of other people, neighbors, don't really know that this is going on, or tend to close their eyes about this going on.
Absolutely, but again, fiction, we have lots of fiction which is actually quite sexualized.
Yes.
And censors tend not to bother so much with it because it's fiction, and who reads novels, who reads poetry. It's not as worrying for the authorities as films, let's say. We will see I Am Struggling, and anyone who has any contacts or any suggestions of publishers in the Arab region, all suggestions gratefully received. But it will be a very big test of this book. It is, however, coming out in Bahasa, Indonesia, next month, in fact. So, we'll see.
Thank you all very, very much for spending a Friday evening with us.
Yes, thank you.
It's been a great pleasure. A word from our sponsors. And if you, Shireen is also available to talk about Sex and the Citadel at length tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. And so if you have any more questions, anything else you need to know or hear about Shireen, I've threatened her that I'm going to send some of my colleagues, some of my
Keep me on my toes.
Exactly, some of my journalist colleagues to do that. The next World Voices session is on the 14th of September at 4 p.m. And it features Gillian and Werner Binkley, who co-founded Proverse Hong Kong and the Proverse Prize. Any details or anything else you want to know about the Arts House, it would be found on their website, which is, unimaginatively, thearthouse.com.sg. I would recommend you send them, you add yourself to the mailing list. I have.